I am a librarian at the Dr. John Archer Library at the University of Regina. We are about to begin our presentation on self-censorship. We have five speakers, I think 5 speakers today, should really count that. We will be recording this. I should actually say that online. Apparently we are recording this. So yeah, we will be recording this. So if you are asking any questions, you will be put online at some point. We're going to save our questions to the end. So let me just bring this up. Okay. So welcome everyone. We're going to be having 5 speakers. The first speaker, I should say also that this presentation is presented by the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship and the Rational Space Network at Mount Royal University. Our first speaker today is going to be Christina Bama, who teaches philosophy at Kwantlen Polytechnic University in Surrey, BC. She focuses on philosophy of language and language evolution. Having grown up in East Germany, she is increasingly concerned about the limits on freedom of speech at Canadian universities. Christina, are you ready to present?
Thank you, Robert. Can people hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Good.
Yes.
Yeah, so I was actually, when I decided on what I would be talking about, I had no idea about the events that are unfolding in the United States right now. So I'm a little bit tempted to do this as kind of like performative art and just sit here for 10 minutes quietly and self-censor. So just to really make sure that people are aware of what I'm about to say has absolutely nothing to do with what is going on in the United States. Self-censorship, broadly construed, is the act of censoring or classifying one's own discourse. And people do that out of fear or deference to the sensibilities and preferences, actual or perceived, of others, without overt pressure from any specific party or institutional authority. So we do that over and above what is already written into the requirements, how to conduct ourselves as university teachers and so on. Self-censorship can also occur in order to conform to the expectations of the group one belongs to. For example, university teachers may consciously or unconsciously avoid any topics that they fear could anger their colleagues and or their employers. And university teachers can lose their jobs, they can be denied promotion, probably the most likely is don't get invited to conferences and so on. Now, what I want to talk about is how accusations of racism actually interfere with critical and rational discourse on universities about current events. So the moment the Corona crisis reached North America, powerful demonstrations against racism began in the United States and in Canada, and specifically at university campuses. So it takes surprisingly little time actually to find all kinds of news articles, racist intentions laid bare as coronavirus fears fester at Western University. UC Berkeley faces backlash after stating xenophobia as a common and normal reaction to coronavirus. Coronavirus on college campuses fight fear and racism and so on. So the moment people were expressing virtually any statements that involved people from China, it was usually labeled as racist. And so I want to just cite from one of those articles that claim or that talks about racist and discriminatory incidents. It's Students have donned face masks in the classroom, and an online petition to suspend classes at the University of California, Santa Barbara collected more than 1,100 signatures. Now this is actually, when we're looking back, very mild compared to the measures that have been implemented meantime. People of East Asian descent have spoken of feelings of self-conscious coughing in public and experiencing subtle ostracism, from people keeping their distance on public transportation, in crowds, and at school. Again, social distancing. We are now all required to do it. And of course, back then in early February, that's when the article was published, it was also claimed that coronavirus might not be scarier than the flu. But what we don't know is what frightens us. And the author of this article suggests that we look at this crisis as an opportunity for honest dialogue in our shared school, work, and community spaces. As teachers, we embrace these moments to push forward uncomfortable discussions that increases understanding of the socio-historical legacies and anti-immigrant sentiment bubbling up today. Full disclosure, I'm an immigrant. I never, like what I experience, never gets labeled racist or even xenophobic because the way I look, but that's just a different story. The question is how any honest dialogue can actually ensue when certain questions cannot be asked because they may be perceived as racist. And of course, we have to ask ourselves, even in the early days, whether or not racism was actually the only explanation for fears expressed by Canadians and presumably also by Americans. So we all still have in vivid memory the news reports about how Canadians got evacuated from China, how Canadian families, especially families with small children, had a really, really hard time, and how once they finally got to Canada, how they immediately were put under quarantine. And so the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of National Defense, and so on, they all expressed great gratitude for the efforts that went into getting those people home from Hubei. So on one hand, you have this awareness that the government actually needed to get families back out of this horrible situation. On the other hand, when you had people that were expressing fear, they were immediately labeled as racists. So in January and February, there were quite a few Canadians that got more and more concerned and called on our government to close the border to people coming from China. Those people were immediately called racist. Other people suggested that people returning from China should self-isolate until it was certain that they were not infected. Those people also were called racists. And in spite of the increasingly severe news from Wuhan, the top health authorities, the national and provincial governments, and the media were assuring us that the risk for Canadians is extremely low. So you have seen those reports that the risk is extremely low until way into March, actually. Now, as university teachers, we obviously ought to use rational argument to challenge reports in the news and actions of the government. I can, of course, say, well, I didn't teach at that time, so I had no opportunity to bring that up in the classroom, but to be brutally honest, I don't know if I would have dared to bring it up in the classroom at the time. So accusations of racism obviously have serious consequences for university teachers. And so I would say that at least some of us really self-censored because we feared to be called racists. And so some of the arguments that we didn't make, but we probably should have made back then, are to follow. Given what we already knew back in December and January, how dangerous COVID-19 is, how easily it gets transmitted, that there is no cure, no treatment, no vaccine, and there are actually only very few reasons that would make a rational and responsible government act in the way that our government did back in January, February, even early March. Our government could have assumed that most Canadians have a better immune system than Chinese people. So while the coronavirus was wreaking havoc in China, if it actually would make it here, our superior immune system would avoid that people here were experiencing the same dire effects. But of course, such an assumption is racist. Given what we knew already back then, our government probably could have assumed that Canadians use better hygiene, are more disciplined than people in China. So even if COVID got to Canada, we could use our rigorous hygiene, and unlike the Chinese, we would prevent the virus from spreading. Again, that is racist. We also could have assumed that even if COVID-19 got here and would spread as quickly and as widely as in China, our healthcare system is so superior that we would be able to treat people where the Chinese healthcare system actually has failed. Again, that is racist. Another thing that occurred during the coronavirus crisis in Canada is that our top health official, Dr. Theresa Tam, severely changed her position on wearing face masks. So in February, she told us wearing face masks when you're well is not an effective measure. Sometimes it can actually prevent some risks. So you're putting your fingers up and down your face, removing your mask, putting them next to your eyes. In late March, she was saying, while face masks can cut down on the spread of the coronavirus when worn by someone already infected, it does little for healthy individuals. Wearing a face mask can even have adverse effects, including giving people a false sense of confidence. So Theresa Tam was very clear. If you're healthy, you shouldn't be wearing a face mask in public. At the same time, people that actually were wearing masks in public, especially of Asian descent, were stigmatized. Some students have taken precautions, for instance, with wearing face masks. Unfortunately, mask wearers have since become targets for stigmatization, as if everybody wearing one is either infected or being overly dramatic. People who look Chinese, particularly those wearing masks, are at increased risk of experiencing discrimination. Now, in the meantime, Dr. Tam actually has changed her position on face masks. And she says now that Canadians should wear a mask as an added layer of protection whenever physical distancing is impossible. So during the spring and summer months, strict adherence to public health basics of physical distancing must continue as a bare minimum. In addition, where COVID-19 activity is occurring, use of non-medical masks is recommended as a layer of protection when physical distancing is difficult to maintain. This is, of course, saying what a lot of people had said all along. And then people again have pointed that out, they were being accused of being racist. Now, the consequences of self-censorship are actually pretty serious. Self-censorship prevents many academics from critically examining accepted truths, especially if there is a risk that we are perceived as unfairly treating members of minorities. Self-censorship prevents students from taking risks and asking challenging questions. And you probably all have experienced that. The moment you start lecturing, students try to figure out what is safe to say and what is not safe to say. Given that many political leaders and journalists actually go through the university system, self-censorship that occurs in the university does not really stay in the university. So this is where people basically learn it's okay to self-censor. Self-censorship has serious consequences for our society, not just in the case of COVID-19, although I suggest in the case of COVID-19, it had really serious consequences that we are still not comfortable with even acknowledging, let alone discussing. Okay, I think my 10 minutes are up. Yeah, sorry for going a little bit over time. And I guess for later, if anyone has questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you very much, Christina. Our next speaker will be Louis Groark. Sorry, I'll try not to butcher that. For Louis Groark, who teaches ethics and political philosophy in the philosophy department at St. Francis Xavier University. He has published books on Aristotle, the history of ethics, literature, and good rebellion. He is interested in debates about the nature of university education in the 21st century. Go ahead, Louis.
Okay, thank you very much, Robert, and thanks to everybody who's listening in. First, let me thank everybody who made this event possible and organized it. I think it is an important issue. I will only talk briefly, but I can say, as being on the front lines, teaching ethics, political philosophy, anything that has to do with values, professors, my colleagues are all terribly worried today about what they say in the classroom. And I would say that this is anecdotal, but compared to 10 years ago, or God help us, I'm an older guy, 20 years ago, there is much more concern than there used to be. So what I want to talk about is, I thought, I want to give an example and I want to make a distinction. And I'll start with a distinction. Philosophers like to make distinctions. I thought I would say, first of all, a little bit about what self-censorship is, or at least, as far as I can make out. And I thought I would make a distinction between the good, the bad, and the ugly. And being a philosopher, and philosophers like to play the devil's advocate, thinking about self-censorship, one thing that struck me is that maybe there is a good kind of self-censorship. So there are situations, and I'm concerned with teaching. I'm not so much concerned with the political arena here, but there are, situations in a classroom. I'm talking about end-of-life issues. There's been a suicide on campus. The person who was the best friend of the person who committed suicide is there. I might refrain, hold back, modify what I'm doing to be a little bit more gentle, a little bit more careful than I usually am. I usually insist on robust discussion in class. And, that seems appropriate. That seems like there's nothing wrong with that. And in fact, I would think a good teacher has to be sensitive to where the students are. And there may be situations then in which you might think intuitively, automatically, I should say this, and then you hold yourself back a bit, you refrain because you want to keep some kind of level of collegiality in the class or whatever. It's like the situation in ethics. Your dear mother asks you if she looks fat. She looks fat. You don't say that she looks fat. You refrain, you hold yourself back. And so there are situations, it seems to me, in which courtesy, but even, helping sort of the teaching environment, we hold ourselves back, and that's okay. That's the good kind of self-censorship. The bad kind, it seems to me, is when there's something that comes from the outside, which is not part of the teaching situation, where one feels that there's an authority outside the classroom. Philosophers try to make students think hard about issues, raise questions. We object to all sorts of things, pros and cons on every issue. And I think that sometimes we feel there's something external to the teaching situation, which is somehow administrative issues, perhaps political correctness, but which is forcing us not to say what would be appropriate to say. In fact, what would be good to say in terms of, say, a classroom discussion. And that's the bad kind of self-censorship. And then I think there is the ugly kind. The bad kind happens once in a blue moon. Maybe, we make a mistake of judgment in a class. I don't say something I could have said. But then there are certain issues, sexual issues, religious issues, political issues, where over and over and over again, there's a regular sort of a pattern, given the ambiance, the political climate in universities right now. We know again and again we shouldn't talk about certain things. We shouldn't make certain jokes. Jokes are sometimes good when you're teaching. It's a good pedagogical strategy. But there's some pattern that's out there which we are effectively coerced, made to pay attention to and to comply to, and that's the ugly kind of self-censorship. And again, my impression is that third kind, which is not a one-time deal, but there's this subject that you're not allowed to talk about, or this point of view that you're not allowed to talk about. And talking to my colleagues, this is more and more a regular thing that people are terribly afraid of. So I wanted to bring up two examples. One involves me and one involves a colleague of mine. And then sort of, understand the situation in terms of something concrete in particular. So here's something that happened to me actually this term. And I want to be gentle with my dean and whatever, but I was in a situation, I had a good class. I mentioned to the students, because some students I thought needed encouragement. Some of them had learning disabilities. And I mentioned to the students that I myself was dyslexic, that I have a bit of problem. I can't tell right from left. Whether it's a B or a D, I've always had some problems with this going through. And the intent of me bringing this up was that, hey, you can succeed. Look, I'm a professor. I got a PhD, and in my day, there were no special offices or advisors, or there was no extra help, and yet I managed to get through. Someone went to the disability office and complained that I had been making not quite a joke, but that I had insulted students with disabilities. My dean contacted me, said, what's going on? I was told to apologize to the student. I had to explain the situation, that, hey, I wasn't, demeaning students with disabilities. Hey, I'm a student with disability. Anyways, there was a whole series of issues that came up. I had to explain myself. Of course, I was worried about this. I actually did. I think it was a mistake, but I did apologize to the class, saying, well, look, this is a misunderstanding. And my reaction after all that was, and this is what Christina has been talking about and other people will talk about, I'm never going to mention dyslexia in class again. It's too much of a hassle. Even if there's a situation when there's a student with dyslexia and very promising and needs to be say, hey, you can get through it. It's okay. Look, I did. You know, the immediate reaction that I have as a professor, I've got a busy life. I don't need to be sending long-winded emails back and forth with the dean, trying to explain myself. I just won't talk about it. And that wasn't a political issue. It wasn't even a moral issue. It was just, and we could maybe talk in question and answer period, what's going on. But that was just a genuine personal comment to try and help out students. And now I'm sort of left thinking, hey, you better not talk about this. I'll talk about one other example. And there's a young colleague. He is a part-timer. So he is particularly vulnerable. And he was teaching Canadian history. He was teaching in the history department. And of course, the beginnings of Canadian history have a lot to do with Aboriginal peoples, with First Nations, and that's fine. I can assure you this particular person is very fair-minded. There's no kind of, racist animosity, hostility. He said something, I won't get into the specific issue, it's a minor issue, but there was an Aboriginal student in the class which complained, and it went to the dean and to the First Nations activist person on the campus, and he spent 2 weeks feeling very, very vulnerable because he's a person that needs a job. 2 weeks dealing with the dean, dealing with the student, dealing with the office, the student life office, and finally convincing them that in fact, he didn't mean this in any kind of discriminatory or prejudicial or unfair way. But what I found was interesting was after this all happened, I talked to him, tried to reassure him. He's a young guy, and he said to me, Louis, I will never talk about that in class again. And it's a sort of a more minor issue in Canadian history, but nevertheless, he said, I can't go through this. He has a family, he's trying to get a job. I can't go through, so this particular issue, I just cannot talk about this in class again. And this is the kind of thing that's going on in universities. I think it's something we should all be worried about. The sad thing is that in the end, I think it's a barrier to good teaching. It's an obstacle to good teaching because there are issues that we should talk about, which are misunderstood sometimes by students, on which there are standards of political correctness or whatever, that may take something the wrong way, whatever. But as a professor and not wanting to deal with all the hassle that comes with mentioning these subjects, there's a pattern out there. It's just easier to be quiet. It's just easier to do nothing, which is terribly unfortunate. And that's why I think this is good to talk about this. And thanks for letting me participate in the discussion.
Thank you very much, Louis. Yes. Okay, our next speaker is Pamela Lindsay. She's completed all but the defense for a master in philosophy. Her research is in belief acquisition and maintenance, and I believe she's joining us from Lethbridge. Is that right?
That's correct, yeah.
Please go ahead.
Hello. This is a student's perspective. In 2010, at the age of 44, I went to university for the first time. I felt I was home. Each day I sat in the front row, riveted by the lecture. Note that riveted connotes attention, curiosity, intrigue, all the drivers of inquiry and mobility of thought. While in a strict sense, it means immobility, being firmly fastened down. To rivet is to join one thing to another, securing a very strong bond. Just as an airplane needs rivets on its wings to soar, university gave wing to my love of reading and writing, and to my ideas. But flying comes with hazards. If, when cruising at an altitude of 31,000 feet, you see the rivets on the wing popping off, you're going to feel a tad panicky. People also feel this way when social bonds come apart. In both cases, they grip whatever they can in an attempt to keep it together. In any sense, from emotional composure through to keeping intact a marriage, a friendship, a career, or a wing. I grew up in a small sawmill town in central BC, yet my life has many parallels with J.D. Vance, Yale-educated lawyer and author of Hillbilly Elegy, whose family hails from the Appalachians. Vance's family were among those who became the working poor in the Ohio Rust Belt. Vance notes that hillbillies are fiercely loyal, and bettering one's lot can be a betrayal. It pops rivets. As he says, in quotes, a remarkable stigma attached to people who left the hills of Kentucky for a better life. Hillbillies have a phrase, too big for your britches, to describe those who think they're better than the stock they came from, unquote. I carry the stigma. There is a parallel between class betrayal outside of the university and ideological betrayal within, as well as with the mechanism of self-censorship operative in each case. Vance's family managed to set him on the road to a higher education. Mine didn't. How I went to university at 44 is another story. It's what happened afterwards that concerns us here. Dad called me a commie. Mom said I changed. I talked different. Once I seen a moose yesterday, now I saw one. On one hand, my parents fear I'll look down on them. On another, we're becoming strangers. As the rivets pop, my parents hammer them down. Don't let your head get too big. I don't care what some university professor has to say. They're no smarter than anyone else. Worried I was being brainwashed, Dad gave me a wall hanging that reads, "Better is one's own path, though imperfect, than the path of another well-made." Dad doesn't want me to follow my own path. He wants me to follow his. One day, Dad broke down in tears and said, "I'm scared you won't love me anymore." I'm not alone. I've heard a number of Thanksgiving dinner nightmare stories, uncle, siblings, cousins, taunt, "You think you're so smart now that you're in university. Well, aren't you, Miss Know-It-All?" But strained as they are, these relationships are worth keeping. They're the battered wings that carried us this far, the props that won't fail us in a storm. And so we too fasten the rivets, immobilizing our intellectual worlds through self-censorship. Thankfully, we needn't self-censor in university. Or so I thought. Like solidarity, loyalty is a stereotypical working class trait. Loyalty has negative connotations, such as blind obedience, and recently, as worries Vance, the associations some make between the poor working class and their loyalty to Trump. But loyalty has many positive functions. It's one of the assurances we have that we can rely on others, that you have my back and I yours. Without these assurances, life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Hume observes, philosophers in all the active parts of life are in the main the same with the vulgar, and are governed by the same maxims. Academics don't always acknowledge the extent of the demands of loyalty within academe, and to recognize its effect on their own behaviors. The negative connotations of loyalty and its association with uneducated people might contribute to this myopia. But there are also other contributing factors, each with the potential to adversely affect scholarship. Humans are notoriously bad at self-criticism, so we need others to provide that criticism for us, a protocol built into the university. However, we're not likely to take correction from just anyone. No matter how polite, clearly stated, and accurate that criticism, if it comes from the lips of someone we find morally reprehensible, intellectually inferior, or both, it's likely to be rejected. In the worst case scenario, we might be spurred to pursue our possibly erroneous reasoning with all the more vigor, the so-called backfire effect. And if our mistakes are particularly embarrassing, we dislike our critic all the more. Peer review is supposed to help mitigate this problem, but not for students. What happens when a student levels a criticism perceived as morally reprehensible against the backdrop of her professor's cherished ideological convictions? Or the more daunting case of a cohort of professors expounding these convictions. A student might avoid taking classes from one prof, but can't from all. Growing up, I stood on the picket line with my parents and community. In IWA solidarity, we warmed our hands over burn barrels adjacent to the railroad tracks. And the Teamsters patrolled logging roads, hunting for trucks, supplying the mill. Woe to the driver found alone in the backwoods. I recognize a particular dynamic and I know what happens to scabs. Observation is a powerful teacher, but it's hard to observe ourselves. We don't always detect a loss of perspective because as far as we can tell, we still have one. But also because this slide can happen so incrementally, we fail to notice. In Thinking Fast and Slow, Daniel Kahneman notes that it is much easier to detect a cognitive minefield when you observe others walking into it than when you're about to do so. Hence the need for critics. But when ideological commitments pervade scholarly work, one can be precariously averse to criticism. Criticism is felt not as an evaluation of one's argument, but as an assault on all that is good and right. It pops rivets. And so one tightens her grip and guards her belief commitment, Gollum-like as her precious. Students are observers, and we notice when a prof has a precious. A common precious is anthropogenic global warming, AGW. Those who question AGW are evil, greedy criminals in the pocket of big oil. There are no neutrals. CF George W. Bush, if you're not with us, you're with the terrorists, or in this case, AGW deniers. When I proposed an independent study on epistemic authority, my supervisor added the words "and denialism." He wanted me to write about the badness of deniers. I wanted to do a conceptual analysis of the term. Now I carry the stigma of ideological betrayal. My co-supervisor told me my thesis proposal sounds like Fox News. Then added, and you don't want to sound like that, do you? The message I got was, if you continue on this path, this way be dragons. So of course I said, no. Here's the kicker. I too feel betrayed. Who taught me that conceptual analysis is the business of philosophy, no holds barred? Ironically, my supervisor had a sign on his bulletin board that said, question authority. I was tempted to add the words, except mine. There's no fault in a prof being an advocate for his precious, or even dedicating a class to his advocacy, just so long as students know which hat the prof is wearing, advocate or scholar, whether he's changed hats at some point in the discussion, and which hat he'll wear when her work is evaluated. For many students, university is home, complete with nightmare Thanksgiving dinners. And then we must choose. Do we loosen the rivets or hammer them down? Speak up or self-censor? To whom is the student beholden? To herself, she takes into account her finances, reputation, GPA, letters of recommendation, and her future career prospects. To her prof, the hours he's mentored her, his better judgment, the career criteria for evaluation that he's free to set as he sees fit. To her student peers, how they might be affected if she rocks the boat, or if she doesn't, and whether they'll feel pressured to take sides. To the discipline and to the scholarly community, epistemic rigor. To the broader community, what she owes the widow's mite. Whether we immobilize our intellectual worlds through self-censorship is weighed against what befalls us if we pull the pin. Who is to blame if we don't? And how many rivets must pop before the university drops from the sky? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pamela. The next speaker we'll be having is Mark Mercer. Mark teaches philosophy at St. Mary's University in Halifax, and he's president of the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship. Please
Thanks, Robert.
start, Mark. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. Hello, everyone. I have a thesis. My thesis is that were those participating in an academic discussion simply to attend to the academic purpose of that discussion, self-censorship would take care of itself. So the task then is to find ways to get people participating in academic discussions to attend to the academic purpose of the discussion. Now, in presenting and defending that thesis, I want to criticize a particular common way of attempting to respond to the problem of self-censorship in universities. So I'm going to argue for my position and along the way criticize what I take to be a common popular suggestion. That suggestion is to create a system of rules or guidelines for productive discussions, especially productive discussions of sensitive topics. Self-censorship. I think the three panelists before me have described it accurately, but quickly to restate. Self-censorship, refraining from saying or writing something that one believes could contribute to the academic purpose of the discussion. So I'm building the academic purpose of the discussion in. Refraining from saying it or writing it because one fears losing friends or losing status or attracting hostility. Now, what one judges to potentially contribute to the academic purpose of the discussion may not be simply speaking a truth. You might float an idea, say something that you believe to be false, but you think useful to discuss. And I agree with Louis that humor, jokes, witticisms, comments, observations about things not on the table might also have that good effect on moving the discussion forward. I need also to say what I think the academic purpose of discussions, academic discussions are, if I'm limiting my concern about self-censorship to context of academic discussions. I think there are three sorts of academic purpose, or three academic purposes. The first, and I suspect this is the one that no one will disagree with, but maybe, figuring something out. Understanding something, that's one purpose of academic discussion. We want to understand how things are as they are, and we engage in discussion with others as part of the process of doing so. It's not the only process in which we engage when we're trying to figure things out, but it is one. The second is fashioning an interpretation of something, a work of art, for instance, or a social movement. Fashioning an interpretation may not be figuring out how things are. There might be no way in which things are that corresponds to the interpretation, and yet the interpretation can be evaluated as strong or weak, rich, impoverished, the like. So another reason we engage in academic discussion is to fashion interpretations of things. The final thing is evaluating or appreciating something, that is rendering valuations of it. Now, I take it that Louis and other realists about value would assimilate that to the first thing, figuring something out, and maybe that's right. I think it's something separate. Anyway, understanding, interpreting, and evaluating. We engage in academic discussions in order to figure things out, to fashion interpretations, and to work through our evaluations of them. The academic method, by and large, not entirely, but a core element of the academic method of going about these three things is to hold theses and arguments at arm's length. They can be theses and arguments that one takes to be true and sound, but in discussing them, you put them on the blackboard, and that's where they are. They're not representative as we discuss them. They're not representing any particular person's theses or arguments, and we investigate them. That's the core, but I want to say that there are also academically relevant discussions where self-censorship occurs and self-censorship is a problem. Not academic discussions, but academically relevant discussions. And these have to do with the care of the university. Sometimes we want to talk about the university, about programs and projects, the union, cafeteria, whatever. These two count, I think, as academic discussions just because they're relevant to academic discussion. So refraining from saying or writing something that one believes would contribute to an academically relevant discussion out of fear of putting something that matters to one at risk is to self-censor. There are people who are not given to self-censorship, and I want to describe 3 ways in which people may not give in to self-censorship. The first type of person is one who cares little about the costs or penalties they might incur because they cherish their image, their self-image, as disputatious or outspoken or curmudgeonly. So for them, whatever the consequences to other things that they care about, the bad consequences to other things they care about might be, they would rather be on record as being outspoken, disputatious, or whatever. The second group of people who are not particularly given to self-censorship are those who happen to value the academic engagement so highly that they will not compromise that engagement, however high the cost to other things that matter to them might be. Well, however high, well, sometimes the cost might be really high, but at any rate, those who value the academic engagement highly are less given to self-censorship than those who don't value it highly. Why? Because it matters more, because the engagement matters more to them than the losses that they fear. Finally, the third sort of person who is not given to self-censorship is one who finds the risks or the penalties of candor to be low. If the risks or penalties one perceives to be low, then self-censorship is not a useful mode of advancing things that matter to one outside the academic discourse. Okay, now I'm going to set aside the first type of person, those who are disputation, outspoken, or candid by temperament, and thus not given to self-censorship. To look at the other two cases, the cases where one is committed to the academic purposes of academic discussion, and so is willing to take the risks and incur the penalties, and those people who don't perceive the penalties or risks to be very high. Now, the risks and penalties of engaging in academic discussion without self-censorship become smaller as professors and students value increasingly the academic engagement. This is because this is because as people within an academic institution come to value the academic purposes of discussion more highly, they're less willing to impose costs on others. They want others to speak candidly and go with their judgment as to what they think the best things to say and do in the discussion are. So what we want then, I think, if we want to lessen academic self-censorship, is to try to raise the value in which the academic mission, the academic purposes of our discussion is held by those people within the university. Okay, now I'm going to take a small detour and talk about what I have found to be a different approach, a very common approach, and that is the idea of fashioning rules. Here's a set of 6 that one group promulgates. Listen respectfully without interrupting, respect others' views, criticize ideas, not individuals, commit to learning, not debating, avoid blame and speculation, and avoid inflammatory language. This is one sample. There are plenty of other samples to choose from, but they overlap extensively. The idea is that following these rules will foster a more productive discussion. The instructor then, or the moderator at a panel, is to lay out the rules at the beginning and then make violators aware of their violations, either immediately after the violation or perhaps by summoning them to office or talking to them in the hallway after class, make the violators aware that they violated, and praise the class at the end of the class for not having violated the rules. Now, my criticism of this approach is that it gets the thing the entirely wrong way around. Rules get the thing the wrong way around. The discussion isn't productive because people are well-mannered. Rather, attending to the academic purpose of the discussion leads people to at least appear to be well-mannered. Don't listen respectfully or respect others' views as a matter of etiquette, thinking thereby to promote the discussion. Rather, be involved in the discussion, and being involved in the discussion, those sorts of behaviors will follow. But it's not the behavior that matters. It's the point and the purpose and the quality of the discussion. Now, this is a fairly elementary point, I think. The point is that people will act in ways that secure their ends, right? And so what looks like respectful behavior will simply fall out of a serious engagement with the matters at hand. Fairly simple point, people will act in ways that secure their ends. Now, have the people who offer rules as the solution simply forgotten this point? No, I don't think so. Let me give you a short quotation from Emily Chamley Wright from an article called Coaching Students Through the Self-Censorship Dilemma. It's Coaching Students Through the Self-Censorship Dilemma. Emily Chamley Wright says, the university campus is a social space, just as it is an intellectual space. From faculty mentors to classmates, teammates, roommates, and friends, much of the college experience is relational. Learning how to engage with others effectively is an essential part of developing one's reasoning, critical thinking, and moral imagination. In other words, we need relationships as much as we need intellectual content if we are to achieve the ultimate end of a liberal education, human flourishing. Now, the point I want to make about this is that the rules then are not for academic engagement, according to Emily Chamley Wright, but for bringing students into approved patterns of behavior. The end isn't figuring something out or interpreting something. The end is human flourishing. So we put what I take to be perhaps a laudable function of university life, producing people who can contribute to human functioning. That's taken to be the goal of the academic endeavor. But I said the goal of the academic endeavor are three things: figuring something out, generating interpretations, and looking to evaluations. So that's my critique then of the idea that were we to have the right set of rules and to enforce those rules properly, the problem of self-censorship would disappear. My view then, back to the question how to raise the level at which students and colleagues value the academic mission and value engaging academically with the things in the world. Well, I have two and only two ideas, and I'm not sure exactly how to put them into practice. But the first idea is this. What we need to do is disentangle academic purposes, academic engagements, academic missions from what I've called the various functions, however laudable they are, that are often included among academic purposes. To begin disentangling the academic from that which might flow from it, we should articulate to our students and colleagues why we are gathered at the university and make clear that we are here not to prepare for jobs, not to save the world, but to engage with the matters at hand. So that's my first suggestion. My second suggestion is that we can bring people to engage seriously in the academic mission by directly and exclusively engaging in it ourselves, by example, so to speak. When we ourselves participate in academic discussion entirely as part of the academic mission, we influence others to do so as well. So I await your criticisms and critiques of my ideas. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. I'm just going to state before I introduce Francis that if you do have any questions for the panelists, please send them in the chat at the bottom. You can do that anytime between now and the end of, or even after the end of Francis's presentation. Let me just bring this up. Yes, so Frances Widdowson is our final speaker today. She's Associate Professor in the Department of Economics, Justice, and Policy Studies at Mount Royal University in Calgary. She's the founder of Mount Royal University's Rational Space Network and is on the board of the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship. Dr. Widdowson is currently writing a book on how advocacy studies are murdering the human sciences and effective policy development. Frances, take it away.
Thanks very much, Robert, and thank you very much to all the panelists. I think that my ideas will intersect with them to some extent. I have to admit that I'm a bit nervous about this area, which gives you a bit of an indication of the self-censorship problem, which is we're always a bit worried these days about entering into a certain number of issues. And I've been thinking about this quite a bit, and I started to compile, I guess, around a few months ago, the most contentious issues that I see to be existing in universities today. This is not an exhaustive list, and I'm just going to share my screen to give you a sense of what I've seen over the last 10, 15 years as being the most significant in terms of difficulties of discussion. Anyway, so I hope that's on there. I'm just going to start the slideshow here. Looking at this list, I get very worried about it, especially near the top, because even putting these things on a list makes one a bit nervous, because you could be, by just putting these things on a list and saying that, you know, perhaps they should be discussed, you could be accused of actually being a supporter of these ideas, and there could be consequences for you. Anyway, so that what for people who are looking at it, up near the top, that's the most controversial. Down near the bottom, and I put my own name there. I'm actually not very controversial compared to the other areas. I actually did have Margaret Somerville on there, but she got bumped because she was a person who questioned same-sex marriage, and whether I think she was opposed to it because she felt it undermined the institution, and nothing very much happened to her. She was going to get an honorary degree, and people protested it, but in the end, she did get the honorary degree. So, but you'd be nervous about entering into a discussion about whether same-sex marriage undermined the institution of marriage. But all the other areas, I think, are very dangerous, and one worries about this whole area. So those are areas that are very difficult to discuss in the university. But this notion of self-censorship, I think, is very difficult because, and I was thinking about this, we self-censor all the time. You know, I could be, if I didn't self-censor, I would just be one of the most annoying people in the world, because I would just be constantly piping up saying, I don't agree with that, I don't agree with this. So because we don't want to seem unintelligent, or we don't want to alienate other people and we want them to interact with us, we are, you know, constantly engaged in a process of self-censorship in its very broad sense. So I find the word often is very broad. And to illustrate this, I wanted to give two examples, which I personally have been involved in at Mount Royal University, which show some of the difficulties with the concept. The first example is number 3 on the academic freedom top 10 list. And this is the case of Mark Hecht. And for people who have not heard of the Mark Hecht case, it happened at Mount Royal. Mark Hecht wrote an op-ed in the Vancouver Sun in September of 2019, claiming that ethnic diversity undermines social trust. As a result of this op-ed, 2 members of the executive board of the Faculty Association did not support Hecht. As well, a number of professors at Mount Royal University wrote a secret letter to the administration denouncing Hecht and presumably asking that he be censured. We don't actually know what these professors said, because the letter is secret, and I did try to access it through Freedom of Information, but the whole thing was redacted, except for a few words that specifically referred to Hecht. And then Hecht, after this letter was received, Hecht was going to be teaching a field school on social trust in Northern Europe. His field school was canceled. He grieved this decision and he was a contract faculty member. This feeds into Louis' comments. He was a contract faculty member. His field school was canceled. Then what happened was he grieved the decision, and then the Faculty Association decided not to take the grievance to arbitration, which raised all sorts of questions about whether they had failed in their duty of fair representation of Hecht. And it appears we're never going to know the answer to that question. So one can see how it would be very difficult to discuss questions of ethnic diversity at Mount Royal University. That would be and people who would be watching what happened to Hecht would be very reluctant to enter into conversations about that. So therefore, one could claim that it's very likely that there is self-censorship that is occurring around the question of ethnic diversity and social trust at Mount Royal University. The second issue concerned number 8 on the top 10 list, which is about trans identity. And this has been an ongoing issue at Mount Royal University. And when I brought up the Hecht case at a meeting, a faculty association meeting, talking about self-censorship, a faculty member, another contract faculty member, claimed that they too self-censored, and this person was a trans activist. And they said that their self-censorship occurred because they had given a presentation at an arts faculty council meeting. Their presentation was recorded, and as a result of this recording, there was some public commentary about their presentation, which stated, amongst other things, that in order to create trans-affirming spaces at the university, faculty members should interrupt people during meetings and get them to state what their pronouns were. And this public commentary of their presentation stated that this amounted to trans activists acting as quote unquote woke scolds, and it was off-putting and socially authoritarian for trans activists to be doing this. And this contract faculty member, who was a trans activist, said that this was leading them to self-censor because this commentary was not very kind and was not complimentary. And as a result, they felt that they did not have a safe space from which to put forward their arguments and opinions. So that gives you a bit of a sense. So to them, they were not going to be reluctant to say anything in the future because they could be criticized for being a socially authoritarian or making off-putting comments. When I was listening to this, I thought, wow, that's very interesting that someone would think that that is the same as the Mark Hecht case. Because if someone had commented that this person should be fired for making these remarks or had denounced them, then I could see how this could result in self-censorship. But just because you're criticized, this shouldn't be an issue. And furthermore, this faculty member was widely celebrated at Arts Faculty Council. In fact, a motion was passed saying that everyone supported this person's efforts to make the classroom and the university a more welcoming space for marginalized identities. So in looking at these two cases, I really think that the trans activist comments is really not what we're trying to get at with self-censorship. It really is about the fear of reprisals. That's what the main concern is. And I think that's really what should be the focus, is that you fear that something is your job is going to be lost, you're going to be denounced, you're going to have to go through the kinds of complaints processes that Louis was talking about in his case. And I think that should be the focus. And one of the biggest problems with respect to this is that we heard last talk that we had that Sinclair McRae gave when he was reviewing Joseph Heath's book, Enlightenment 2.0, that the university is one of the only areas in society where we used to feel that we would be able to say things without reprisals. And the reason for this is because the university has built up what Heath called a system of scaffolding, which protects professors from reprisals. And the problem is that this scaffolding is being dismantled. It's deteriorating, and it's becoming more and more difficult for professors to speak freely because of this scaffolding being dismantled. And I think that there are three really serious problems that are contributing to this. The first is university corporatization, and also the related problem of contract faculty, the increasing numbers of contract faculty. University corporatization is when the university sees itself as a business. The customer, which is the students, are always right, and the employees, who are the faculty members, are there to sort of serve the brand of the university. And at Mount Royal University, for example, we have our slogan is "You belong here," and that slogan was actually used against Mark Hecht because it was claimed that because he was writing about ethnic diversity, undermining social trust, he made certain numbers of students feel that they didn't belong there, and therefore, to some extent, he should be denounced or he should be censured in some way. So I think this is a very serious problem. The second problem is faculty association politicization. That was another difficulty with Hecht, is that, the faculty association, at least there's questions about whether they actually did fairly represent him. And now often faculty associations are becoming ideologically compromised. One of the most common ways in which this happens is with diversity, inclusion, and equity ideology becoming part of the nature of the faculty association. And at Mount Royal, as our mission statement, it says that we will uphold the mission of equity and diversity and equity. That is part of our mandate. And so, of course, Mark Hecht could have been seen as violating that, sort of that mission that the faculty association had. And then finally, I think is a very serious problem of legislation, which is now in existence, which, and there's a number of these areas. Hate speech legislation is one, as well human rights legislation and sort of the idea of discrimination. And then health and safety legislation is another area. And all these are kind of legislation which restricts speech. And Mark Hecht, again, we can see how this was used against him. He was accused of by just writing an article, was accused of discriminating against people. Many said that, and I believe it was a Human Rights Commission in British Columbia, said that his article was a call to hatred, which seemed to me to be an indication that there was some, musing about whether he should be charged with hate speech. And then health and safety legislation has got all sorts of restrictions on speech now with respect to harassment. If you say something that a particular group doesn't like, you could be seen as a harasser. So I think, this legislation is very alarming in terms of, sort of taking away some of the scaffolding which is necessary at universities. So in conclusion, what I would argue is that the scaffolding that used to exist at universities is being dismantled. And I think in terms of trying to fight this problem of self-censorship, much more effort should be put into trying to build up this scaffolding once again to make it much more easy for professors to be able to feel that they can speak freely without suffering reprisals. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Francis. We are going to go on to the question and answer period for any of the presenters who've presented today. If you want to ask a question, just send it in the group chat, which you can access at the bottom of the screen, and I will call on you. The first person I'm going to call on is Sink. He wanted to make a comment or question, I believe. Sink.
Thanks, Robert. Can you just give me the thumbs up if my microphone is working okay? Excellent, thank you. Thanks, everybody, and thanks for organizing this, whoever was behind the organizing. I just had a quick comment I wanted to make. It's actually a teaching tip. I teach ethics and value theory, and I've been doing it a long time. So to Mark's point about how you focus in a classroom on the academic purpose of the discussion, how do you do that while you're also dealing with highly sensitive or controversial topics? A method that I use for a long time, I don't know who to credit for this. It could have been a rare case where I thought of it myself, but I don't remember. Anyways, is a game that I call What's My Problem? So when I play the game What's My Problem, I'm a philosopher, I always defend a position that has a serious flaw in it. And I sometimes actually literally put on a hat to indicate that I'm taking on the persona of this person. So, for example, I'll defend Nietzsche or Thrasymachus or a Spartan view about stealing. But one of the games that I've been playing for a long time is a game called Whiteland, where that's sort of #1 on Francis's list. I defend the formation of a state of white supremacists. And the idea is that I try to defend that view as strongly and as well as I can. And I invite my students to criticize that. And there's a lot of bad thinking that masquerades as moral righteousness among our students. So what happens is, in all the years that I've been talking about Whiteland, I don't think any group of students has ever identified the problem. So for people who say that I'm slipping in some sort of subversive view, I always say, well, the game is called What's My Problem, not Why Am I Correct? So it's a way of depersonalizing discussion of controversial issues that forces people actually to focus on critical thinking and defending their values and defending their beliefs. Okay, I'll stop there. Thanks very much. And I'm going to pass it back to you, Robert.
Thank you very much, Sink. I'm just going to call on Mark. He had a question. Or actually, Louis wanted to make just a comment on in response. So maybe we'll go to Louis first, and then back to Mark, if that's okay.
What I would say is that every professor is different, and every professor has a different style. And when you're dealing with a far out, issue like white supremacism, that's not very hard. But when you're talking about end of life issues, about reproductive issues, about sexual orientation issues, I think it's much more complicated. It sounds like you've got a way that works for you, but again, professors are just very, very different. I think Mark is right that there's no rule, and I know you're not suggesting a rule, but there's no one way to try and teach well and bring up difficult issues and challenge students. So it sounds like you found a great way to do it. But again, it just seems to me, depending on who you are, what your personality is, what kind of students you're dealing with, what level, so on and so forth, it just gets complicated. And again, you made a good suggestion, but I don't think there's just one way of doing it, I guess. Thank you.
Thank you, Louis. I guess I should just mention in terms of Sync's comment that one of our former board members at SAFS did make, I think, tried to do something similar once, where he defended child pornography, and in a similar way, and it caused a great national uprising of indignation across the sphere, and inevitably ended up in him publishing a book on it, which persona non grata is a great thing to read by Tom Flanagan. We can move on to Mark's comments, I believe.
Well, I wanted to ask Louis a question about the dean in this case. What exactly was the dean up to? What was the dean trying to do in this case? That's my question to Louis. What was the goal that the dean was trying to reach?
Okay, I think that's a good question. I don't want to focus so much on my particular case, but I do have a sort of an answer to that. I remember when I was a graduate student and I was a TA, and I worked with two kinds of professors, and you're just starting out in your career and you're marking students, and sometimes there are irate students. And I always found it was important to have a professor behind you that supported you and gave you the benefit of the doubt. And I think that's what's happened at universities is that's not the case anymore. So that as a professor, and it only takes one student to misunderstand, or one student to make a complaint, or one student to have hurt feelings. But what one gets, and in this particular case, the suggestion was that I demean and hurt the feelings of students with learning disabilities, and I need to rectify that. Why? Because I think universities are like Francis was explaining. They're in the business of, let's be honest, getting bums in seats, keeping students. There's a social sort of element that you don't want students upset, hurt, outraged, complaining, whatever. And unfortunately, I think what's happened in the big picture is the administration doesn't say, Louis, he's reasonable. We know he's not a racist. We know that, what's going on here, okay. It can't be the way it was described. I think the immediate reaction of administrations tends to be, well, here's this student counselor, or here's this particular student, or somebody, whoever, that make a complaint. And so the administration feels that they have to stand in as kind of a referee and watch over the professor. And of course, this leads to a lot of hassle. And the administration, I think, is just trying to keep students happy. We keep students happy, they'll stay enrolled in our programs and the university will run well and whatever. Let's keep students happy. And if there's one that's upset with the professor, then we better rectify that, and better be rectified mostly by the professor sort of excusing himself, making an apology, whatever. So does that help a little bit, Mark?
Okay, thank you very much, Louis. We're going to call on Wayne next. Wayne Fenska, if you wanted to ask your question or comment.
Yeah, it strikes me that there are two sort of separate types of issues that are being considered here. One, the normative one, regarding what kinds of restrictions can justifiably be placed on public discussions. But the other one is the more pragmatic one of
You can see
what is the best strategy for dealing with university administrations, or perhaps what is the best practical stance for university administrations to take. Like a lot of it, anything that's perceived as having potential for revenue loss, or in the worst of it, the university being sued or having to pay out, they'll just get right on top of it. And so it's not really a free speech issue at all, though the administration may attempt to make it appear to be so. It's really just a public relations, financial prudence issue. So I don't really know what can be done about that. But very quickly, the last thing I wanted to emphasize was, one thing that really bugs me is this idea that if anyone feels uncomfortable, then they've got a legitimate complaint against the person who made them feel uncomfortable. And what we need to consider are some philosophical reasons regarding morally objectionable and morally unobjectionable ways of making someone feel uncomfortable. So I'll just leave it at that and invite any of the panelists to respond in any way they feel appropriate.
I'd like to say, you go ahead, Francis.
You've already spoken, Mark. Yeah, I think that there's a lot of times people say, this is the reason for why this is happening, when it's other underlying factors. And in terms of the prudence with respect to administrators about worrying about being sued and so on, I think what happens is that it's part of this corporatization aspect that is feeding into that, whereby the university is concerned about its reputation and its brand. That's its concern, not with the academic character of the institution. And that's what I was trying to get at with the scaffolding argument, is that we really need to try to reorient how universities are viewed if we're going to be serious about solving this problem. And with respect to the second comment about the people feeling uncomfortable, I have heard the people who are, to some extent, think people should self-censor more. That's their goal. They say, no, it's not uncomfortable. It's not people feeling uncomfortable. It's about these situations where the humanity of a particular identity is being denied. So it's fine for people to feel uncomfortable. It's just when you start to get into that area where you are what they call denying the humanity of a particular group. And I think, this is a very, very difficult area now in universities where we need to say, Mark Hecht, just by putting forth the idea that ethnic diversity undermines social trust, is not involved in discrimination. that is a totally different issue. So I think that's what, this is where the conversation is shifting, is that there would be denial, but it's about discomfort. It's about some much wider, deeper kind of sort of existential kind of issue. Thank you.
Dare I jump in just to say, with the Mark Hecht thing, it struck me, it's at least minimally plausible to claim that such an article would put certain vulnerable groups in jeopardy, and therefore they'd have a legitimate complaint that Mark Hecht is harming them in a pretty specific way.
Well, I would strongly object to that characterization. And if we are going to take that seriously, it would mean that really any attempt to discuss any of these controversial issues to try to get to the truth of these matters is going to become impossible at a university, because it relies upon the subjective perception of groups. Right, because many members of groups didn't take any issue with Mark Hecht's position. It was the sort of the perception that people could respond to his arguments in this way, and then that would lead to discrimination. And so I think that we need to make a firm distinction between ideas, just putting forth an argument, and then what it is that various institutions and society do when they hear that idea.
Can I say something?
Hello. I just was wondering if we could move to Pamela first, and then we'll come back to Christina, because she's been waiting for a while. If Pamela could say what she was going to say.
Unmute.
Somebody's
Unmute.
unmute.
Pamela.
I was trying. I can weigh on it. Yes, so I want to preface my comment with just saying, Louis, I completely hear you and I'm on board with you. That said, I understand there are gatekeepers in university, and well, there should be. Not everybody's going to get through the gates, some fairly, some unfairly. Some will be let go who shouldn't, and some get, some will get through. It just happens that way. Life isn't fair. I'm in my 50s. I've figured that out. That's okay. I do worry when I speak up about my experiences, as I did today, about being a student, that I'm a disgruntled student. So I think that's one strike against students who are trying to speak out about censorship in a university. I'm a mature student, I'm a flake, you're a younger student, you're immature, so I think there is a tendency to dismiss some of the criticisms that we might actually benefit from listening to. We're also, when I first arrived at university, and I came with some idealization because I hadn't been there before, so I realized that's part of, just learning that people are human, but I had it drilled into me that we're part of a scholarly community, and I took that seriously. I took, the methodology seriously, and some people are there for the degree, others are there because they're, with the cohort I'm with, are impassioned and really, care about the subject matter and getting good at what they do and working with people. I am a little bit worried about when you run into, when you start off with something you're passionate about. I was writing on, say, belief acquisition, for example, and you talk it over with people who are close to you, some academics, some friends in the broader community and whatnot. And some of the advice I had was just write something else. Write an easier thesis. Do burn something off. Get your master's thesis, and then you can go on and do whatever you want when you get through over all the hurdles. And after you've put the amount of time and the little I have and the less I have, as compared to younger people and whatnot, I didn't want to have to start all over again. And it just seemed intellectually disingenuous. There's a lot, I felt like a loss of intellectual integrity. And I'm a little worried about that. And I don't know if anybody has, you know, it's more of a general comment, but it's just putting that worry out. You know, you're disgruntled, A, B, you know, this is the sort of thing that we're encouraging. You know, you start ducking and weaving through all the controversial issues. So by the time you work on your doctorate, and I'm not the only person worried about this. I have colleagues at other universities, one in Alberta, one at Waterloo, for example, who are saying, look, I'm really disillusioned with philosophy. I thought this is what I signed up for. I'm, you know, you're scared to say anything. Okay, sorry, done.
Thank you very much, Pamela. Maybe we can move on to Christina's question or comments.
Right, it kind of actually fits in what Pamela just was saying. Somebody said that we are kind of worried that if we upset some students or make them uncomfortable, then they will no longer be students and we cannot really afford that. But if we take that even a little bit seriously, we also have to think about what other students may be uncomfortable, who may not speak up. And so in order to cater to some groups that might get offended, we easily could offend another group. And so this is not really a model that can actually work. And as far as kind of like what Mark Hecht was the name, writing about diversity, yeah, some people probably were uncomfortable about that. But in a way, it's not very different from, for the last 3 years, all those accusations flying about the Russians interfering with the American election. If you constantly hear that, what horrible people the Russians are, and very often there was made no distinction whatsoever between the Russian government and the Russians, then you also have to worry what kind of effect that has on students that are from Russia. Will we be concerned that they are all spies and that kind of stuff? Apparently nobody is. So there seem to be only some groups that actually benefit from this, and other groups get told, well, don't worry about it. Somebody was talking about like using the correct pronouns and that kind of stuff. Recently, Trudeau was constantly talking about protecting Canadians. So at one point I said, shouldn't he also talk about landed immigrants? Most refugees are not really Canadians. We are landed immigrants, and you have to go through an extra step. Immediately I was told, oh, don't worry about it. They are included. Well, I mean, if that is the case, then I probably also shouldn't worry about pronouns. But I'm told if I'm not worrying about pronouns, I'm engaging in hate speech. So all those kind of like self-contradictions, that is something that as university professors, we really ought to actually eliminate and not indulge in. That was my comment.
Thank you very much, Christina. Currently, we have no other questions, so I don't know if we wanted to wrap it up or if anybody had. Sorry, what you want to say something, Mark? Please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. No, I thought you'd sent me a message that. Well, anyway, I want to talk a bit about academic culture in response to Wayne's concerns. It's very risky. We're putting ourselves on the line often, and our students should know that. Why is it risky? What we believe and what we value is central to our identities, to who we think we are, to our self-worth, and those are things that are that we can put on the board and discuss critically. So I think hurt and harm of students and hurt and harm of anyone participating in an academic discussion is always a possibility. I don't think that the harm is wrongful harm, though, so long as people are there participating freely. They should know that this is what we do. I mean, this is true even in the natural sciences. There are views that biologists and physicists have that matter immensely to them, and if people put them on the board and start criticizing them, that can be painful. But that we are putting our self-image, our self-identities at risk by inviting critical discussion of them is part of what academic culture is. If professors know that and students know that. Now again, I think the scaffolding question that Francis brings up is important here as well, because I think the loss of scaffolding has come from the changing views about the academic mission. Maybe not the changing views, but at any rate, elements of the views about academic mission. Some elements are now exaggerated and other elements are diminished. But if the goal of the university is to prepare students to take their places in the managerial and professional realms, and moreover to take their places in more or less the percentage of their group identities, then that can get in the way of taking seriously the academic mission of examining critically people's identities. So if that mission comes to predominate, then other missions that are put at risk by it are lessened. And if students are here, because if students are at universities for one reason and the professors are doing something else, something that can cause them hurt and cause them pain, and indeed potentially cause them harm, then that's a problem. So we want to make the nature of academic community, the nature of our academic commitments known to people as they come into the university, so that whatever hurt and harm is caused is not wrongful harm. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say in response to Wayne, and pick up on something that Francis was talking about.
Okay, thank you, Mark. We have at least three more questions. We'll just go to Francis. She wanted to say something before we move on to the other two.
If someone hasn't spoken yet, they can go first before me because I've already spoken.
Sure. Why don't we do that? Gail had a question.
So my question is, who is deciding what is politically correct? Like, who's making these decisions?
Robert, may I answer?
Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, Gail, nice to see you. At any rate, no, I don't know the answer to that question. I'm just saying that from an academic perspective, I think that it's irrelevant. It doesn't matter, that the question of political correctness shouldn't enter into our discussions at all. Except, of course, if the discussion is, well, what is the politically correct or whatever, if that's our investigation. But that an idea is politically incorrect is neither here nor there from the point of view of academic engagement with the ideas. Just in the same way that if you hold that by saying something you would offend someone, that might be a reason not to say it, but it's only a tiny, tiny reason not to say it, easily outweighed by all sorts of, by whatever reason you have to say it in the context of the academic discussion. So I think that we ought not care what is politically correct or politically incorrect, that's an irrelevant consideration when we're investigating some matter academically.
Can I respond, Robert?
Yes, please, go ahead.
It's a great question. And I I feel your pain. There's this ambiguous, I don't know, sort of woolly kind of idea of what counts as correct or, legitimate or acceptable. And it is very hard to put a finger on. And it even changes so that people that are championed in the media, for example, all of a sudden, a couple of years later, then they're vilified. So I think you're making a good point that like, how is this happening? Where is this agenda or sort of loose sort of set of standards? The one thing I would say, and I say this to my students, I teach philosophy, I say I'm not teaching the cultural wars. So what you have on the internet, what you have in the media, I think for a philosopher, it seems to be very superficial. All the positions that are argued for are more complex. There's more reasons on one side or the other. But somehow the media environment that we're in simplifies things and then makes sort of some kind of good versus evil sort of narrative. And the only thing I can say is I say to the students, we're putting that completely aside. You can be conservative, left-wing, right-wing, religious, atheist, it doesn't matter. And we're going to look in detail. But I agree with you. There's something out there that shapes opinion. And if you go against it, it's very vague. But if you go against it, you may get into trouble. It's a good point. Thank you.
Thank you, Louis. Is there anybody else that wanted to chime in on that? Otherwise, I'm just going to call on Trevor as he had something to say to that.
Yeah, hi. Actually, I think I might have maybe the start of an answer there. And this is, of course, coming from a computer scientist, so please feel free to disregard what I say. But so I think that maybe the answer to that question, who determines what is politically correct, has to do with two things. First of all, of course, there's the whole squeaky wheel gets the grease sort of thing. Whoever makes the most noise, of course. But I think, and this is from my my experience on immersing myself in discussions on Twitter, for example, where the culture wars are being fought nonstop 24/7. I think it has to do with intersectionality. And so the person who has the most intersectionality points gets to determine who is, or what is and what is not politically correct. And intersectionality is a hilarious game to play because, of course, the categories are arbitrary and nobody wins in the end. So I think that might be who decides what's politically correct is, first of all, who bitches the most, and second, who is at the locus of the most intersectional identities that they can tick off. So that's just my uneducated opinion.
Can I make a comment, Robert?
Go ahead, Francis.
I actually put in intersectionality in the chat, so I'm in total agreement with that. Yeah, so for people who don't know what intersectionality is, it's sort of seen as a stack, and the most oppressed are at the bottom and the most oppressive are at the top. And according to this ideology, and it's hooked in with diversity, inclusion, equity ideology. The argument, and it's very, very elaborate, this ideological kind of way of thinking about things. But the argument is that the people who are at the bottom have the most right to speak because they have been the ones who have been the most silenced and oppressed historically. So, and this is interesting too, because I really kind of got a bit of a crash course in this with the trans activist issue, because that is what was leading to all that it continues to be the problem that is facing us with respect to discussing feminist philosophies pertaining to sex and gender. Is the argument is that the trans identity is a more silenced and more oppressed identity than the female identity, and therefore the women, or the female, the XX chromosome people, their views just shut up because they are, you know. And so I found the whole thing completely bizarre, the discussions, but it was all wound up with this, and this is just wreaking havoc with the university. And it's true, you know, your position on top today is going to, as if you start to become more dominant, well, now you're an oppressor. So this is why there's this constantly shifting sands, and it is just, it's a very, very difficult, it's a very, very inconsistent and academically corrosive ideology, which has unfortunately taken over a lot of, including faculty associations, which is probably the most alarming kind of aspect.
Well,
I just want to add something to this, if I may. I agree to some degree with Francis, but I would like to point out that it's not always the most oppressed, however you want to define them, who actually get to speak. It is advocates who speak on their behalf. And they make the claim that the moment you are a member of group X, you have to feel like group X. And that I find is actually way more oppressive than a lot of the other things that happen to them. I mean, how oppressive is it if I misgender something versus if I presuppose if you are a member of that group, you have to abide by all the rules that somebody has laid out for them. We have here in British Columbia experienced that when the Jessica Jeniff case made the rounds. And so many transgender people have pointed out, she doesn't speak for us. Didn't matter. If you're a transgender person, you have to agree with Jessica Jeniff because she's transgender. And we really have to not accept what we are over and over and over being fed, that the most oppressive have the right to speak. Yeah, but then let them actually speak. Don't let some advocates speak on their behalf, because there is a difference. Sorry for interrupting.
Well, I don't think it really even matters whether or not you, I mean, it doesn't matter with intersectionality. It doesn't matter whether or not you personally have actually experienced oppression. It depends on whether or not your group, quote unquote, group, I hate that. It depends on whether or not your group has historically experienced oppression, right? I'm always going to be more, for example, I'm always going to be more privileged than Barack Obama, even though he's much more well-educated than I am, better off than I am, because I don't tick the intersectional boxes that he does, even though he was the president of the United States. It doesn't matter. I'm still an oppressor. Of course, anyhow, I should duck out of that conversation.
Thank you very much, Trevor. I'll just add something to Trevor's point, but on Twitter, I've seen a gradual movement away from the term people of color, POC, because I think some people see it as too inclusive, because it includes Asian people, and Asian people apparently aren't oppressed enough, so they have to move away. And now BIPOC is the new term for oppressed, which means Black and Indigenous people of color, because apparently it's no longer, it's moved. I don't know if it'll always be politically correct to point out POCs as a bad or as an oppressed group. I'm just going to call on Sync next. We have like 4 speakers now, so if he wants to talk again, I'm trying to go in order. Sync.
Thanks, Robert. I had a different one, so if you wanted to talk about this point in particular, I'm happy to step aside. But I'll just make my point quickly.
Just go ahead.
Okay. So I understand from a number of the panelists that the argument against self-censorship is that it impairs the good public exercising of reason within the university. But self-censorship presupposes that one has a platform to speak. And I've noticed just in the last few years, this is anecdotal, but I've just noticed in the last few years, more frequent occurrences of cases where colleagues have declined to hear any criticism that I had to make about some argument or position that they had. And that, it seems to me, is another aspect of the loss of the social scaffolding or the cultural scaffolding in the university that promotes a culture of disputation, principled dissent, and that sort of thing as well. So I kind of see that as related to the problem with self-censorship, where people just say, no, I'm not really interested in your criticism, or I'm not interested in your idea there. And then you're kind of not part of the cool club or the cool group or something like that. It just strikes me as that's another aspect of the same problem of self-censorship. Thanks.
Can I respond to that, Robert?
Sure, go ahead.
Great point. And unfortunately, I think for young academics, you know, I don't know if it used to be, but you would like to think that it used to be, you found something that you thought was very interesting or truthful or gripping or important, and you followed it. Lots of people nowadays, before they decide what they're going to do research on, pay attention to just what you're talking about. Obviously, certain subject matters, certain subdisciplines, certain issues, you're going to get in a lot of trouble if you start to find, let's say, the wrong answers to whatever the question is or whatever. So I think you're right that people carefully construct careers, avoiding certain maybe important issues should be discussed, precisely because they're worried about, you know, they've got to avoid hostility, they've got to get a job, they've got to get tenure, they've got to get articles published, they have to go through referees. And so I think that's an excellent point. I think that is part of the larger picture. So
can I make a comment, Robert?
Sure, quick, and then we'll move on to the next.
Yeah, and this is something I forgot to mention in my talk, just to support Louis and Sink in their what they were talking about there, is it's become such a problem, these kinds of disputation, that idea of disputation, which Mark Mercer talked about in some of his pieces, that even to say that you think something should be discussed, you don't even have a position on it yourself. And that was the case with the top 10 with Kaufness and Tuvel. Neither of those scholars, and I believe they were both philosophers as well, they were just making an argument for the importance of being able to discuss the contentious issues, and even doing that was seen as being, you know, sort of not really something to be supported. So that kind of gives people a bit of an indication of some of the problems that we're facing. If you can't even say, you know, I think we should have the discussion about it. I don't really even know what to think about it. Thanks.
Thank you. Did Andrew without a last name? Sorry, you don't have a last name, and there are two Andrews here. Did you have a question?
I guess it's me. It's Andrew Blair. Yes, I do have a comment. It's to chime in with Francis about scaffolding, which will protect academic freedom. I've interpreted what she's saying as meaning institutional arrangements. Maybe that's not all she meant, but I would like to add that with institutional arrangements, it also helps to have faculty and administration with certain mores and habits of thought and so forth that will make those arrangements work well. So I'm going to say something that's a little bit facetious, but it nevertheless has a serious point. And that is that what we should do is we should get administrators to take SINCS courses so that they can learn a little bit more about principled dissent.
Did anyone want to comment on that? Okay, let's move on to Joseph had a question or a comment to make. Joseph? Hopefully it didn't disappear.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, there we go.
Okay, good. I found the discussion very interesting and a lot of fascinating information provided by all the speakers. The one thing about the concept of political correctness that I've always found so strange is that if you look at the word political, it comes from the Greek word polis. And if you look at the beginnings of philosophy and ultimately the beginnings of the academy, you look at Socrates, and Socrates was constantly criticizing the current philosophical ideas or the moral ideas that were in the society. And what the polis does in the end is they execute them. So I think when people try to speak of something as politically correct or that it's desirable to be politically correct, it in some sense means you're kind of fascist, or at least you want to be a member of a society where everything is controlled by the state. And it's so fundamentally inconsistent with the whole Western intellectual enterprise that it's baffling to me, and it's something that spread from the university to now the media and all the chief political officers we see exercising so much power in the societies, not only North America, Canada, and the States, but also in Europe and so forth. So it's kind of a loss of the genuine sense of academe, I think, when we start worrying about following the so-called politically correct norms that are passed down to us. Yeah, that's about it, all I have to say. So.
Do we even teach the classics anymore?
No, I don't think so.
Some of us. If I could just add to Joe's point, Joe, I agree entirely. The worrisome thing is that it's maybe understandable in politics that this kind of attempt at censoring unusual, different points of view, questioning points of views, the Socrateses of the world. It's understandable that they're pushed aside, right? Callicles says to Socrates, you keep on talking like that, you're going to be put to death. But what's particularly bad nowadays is that the university is supposed to be a place, an arena where there's protected speech, where you can try out ideas. And actually, I thought what Mark said was very pertinent. You can try out a false idea. You can try out an idea which doesn't make sense. But the university is supposed to be this arena where that kind of discussion happens. I can understand out in the world, the real world of politics and business and all the rest, it's a little bit tighter and a little bit meaner. But now it's happening at universities that the Socrates of the world can come up and speak and whatever. And that's pretty disappointing. So, good point.
Well, I actually am more and more reminded of my first university experience. Like Pamela, I got back into Canadian university when that was my late 30s, I think. But anyway, as a mature student. But I took my first university course in East Germany just after high school. And a lot of the things that we are worried right now were the things that were so common in East German universities. So there were certain things you could never say, you could never question. Everybody knew that you could never question them. Like, why, if we are a country of peace, why are we shooting at people that are trying to leave the country? And those kind of questions, we would have gotten exactly the same response that now people are getting when they are talking about transgender identity and stuff like that. And I mean, the really worrisome thing is if you kind of like eliminate this kind of discussion, the questions don't go away. If people self-censor, that doesn't mean that they don't entertain those thoughts anymore. They will find somebody who agrees with them. And I mean, on the internet, you can find all kinds of discussion groups that say horrible things about transgender people. And it is kind of scary because instead of giving students good arguments in universities to deal with that, what we are doing is we're shutting them up. We're telling them, so here is our perceived truth, you have to drink it, it's almost like a Kool-Aid, and don't ask questions. And I mean, this is not how universities should operate.
Thank you very much, Christina. We're at the 2-hour mark now. So I was just wondering if we could have one more question from Wayne. Trevor wants to add something as well, but do we want to just go for those two and then we'll call it a day? Is that good? Okay, so if Wayne had he had his hand up first, so, and then we'll go to Trevor, and then we will come to a conclusion for today's talk.
Okay, I'll just try to make this really quick. I was fascinated by the whole Tuvel blow up, let's call it. As I understand it, she had submitted what was a nicely written, nicely structured, but not super ambitious article that was arguably publishable in the journal. But the problem a number of people had was she wasn't the right kind of person to be writing that kind of article. She was neither trans, she was like white, non-trans, or whatever they call it, comfortable in skin, and there's all of these acronyms I can never keep straight. But the idea was she wasn't the right kind of person to be writing that article, and she also didn't reference the right literature. So there's all these expectations. If you want to talk about a particular subject, you have to include a discussion of certain literature, and you have to be a certain type of person. I don't know, I have no real point here, except I found it fascinating that there were what I took to be some pretty smart people on both sides, and a lot of emotional distortion coming in. So again, I'll just invite any of the panelists, or anyone else for that matter, to respond as they see fit.
Can I respond, Robert?
Please go ahead, Francis.
Yeah, so I followed that case very closely, and actually 2 faculty members at my university wrote demanding that the article be retracted. They were on the list. And basically, it's you come up with the wrong answer. That's really what it amounts to. You come up with the wrong answer, and then that's when everyone starts looking at your identity credentials. If you make the right argument, the argument that people want to hear, then that never gets mentioned. So this kind of feeds into that intersectionality discussion that we were having earlier, is that there's also, and I noticed this with the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs. A number of people at the university that I'm at around Canada, supported the hereditary chiefs, and they were non-Indigenous. And there was quite a blow up at my university where people were saying, you are speaking for, you're not Indigenous, so how can you claim to speak on behalf of people? And it was basically because this is the right thing to do, the right way to think. That was sort of taken as a given. So I think with respect to Tuvel, it really hit a nerve, because everyone had thought that this quote unquote transracial person was a completely beyond the pale type who, obviously was a white person using the black identity for her own purposes. And the fact that could possibly be what was happening with the trans identity was not acceptable, to be having that thought crime. It was a thought crime to even go near that. And so that then resulted in that. So, it was just kind of having the wrong answer, wrong argument. And now all your identity credentials are going to be examined because of that.
Thank you, Francis. I think it's an interesting thing also when people who have the right ideological positions, they're quite orthodox in their thinking, but they're the wrong identity. There's an interesting article from Jonathan Kay on a blow up on Twitter recently between Amanda Jede Knox, who's pro-transgendered ideologue, and she is not transgendered though, because her wife and child are both transgendered. So she writes a book, and she actually writes very well from people who read her work. But people are jealous of that, so they try to silence her because she's a bad, because she's non-transgendered and should not be speaking in support of transgender people when our own people who aren't quite as famous should be able to do that. So it's quite an interesting topic, but I try not to speak too much as I'm just the person moderating. But I will pass it along to Trevor for he can have the, maybe not the final word, but the final question.
Well, they kind of took my question. I don't know if you noticed, but it's the same thing I was going to say, that we don't really worry about strangeness of ideas anymore, but about the person who's asking or who's coming up with the ideas. It's not about whether or not your idea is original, but whether or not you are a member of the identity that should be asking or should be saying, again, having those types of opinions. But I'll approach it from a different angle with current events. So I grew up in northwestern Wisconsin, in a small town, rural town, and the closest metropolitan area anywhere near it is Minneapolis-St. Paul. Of course, Minneapolis-St. Paul, as you all know, is on fire right now. And I have friends and family who live there in Minneapolis. I had to actually call a few of them, trying to make sure that they're okay. And they're all okay, barely, but they're all okay, except for one of them who had his entire neighborhood burned down. Now, I was giving my condolences to him, saying, this is ridiculous. You know, your neighborhood, I mean, it's you did not do this. There's no reason to take it out. And I was saying, you know, rioting is not okay. To the defense of the rioters, I had people jump down my throat and say, well, they were saying, I'm just trying to think, get the wording correct. The argument was that white people should stay out of this because this is not about their community. Now, my good friend from undergrad, his neighborhood is burning down. And I pointed out to him, okay, if this is not about his community, it's his neighborhood that's being burned down. And then I was promptly blocked for disagreeing. Now, the funniest thing about this is that the person a number of the people who jumped down my throat were not African American. They were white. So yeah, backing up, this is translated into scholarship in that if you don't belong to the correct intersectional identity, you cannot have the correct opinions on it. Even if it is your neighborhood being burned down, you cannot have the correct opinion on it because you do not belong to the intersectional identity that people are burning down these neighborhoods on behalf thereof. And so I find that to be topical, I suppose. But that's really all I had to say, other than thanks, guys.
Actually, just in response to that, you can, if you are not the right identity, you can say all sorts of things as long as they agree with what the activists want you to say. And you will notice, and you have noticed it yourself, that quite a few people who have criticized you are not Black people themselves.
Zero of the people who have criticized me.
Right. And it almost seems to be that those people feel they have to be even more, they have to put in more vengeance because they have to prove, hey, I'm an ally. Or ally is not a good word anymore, I learned recently.
Really? Oh, damn.
Yeah, ally is no longer a good word.
So here's kind of a conspiracy theory for you that I've been struggling with, is that it seems to me like a lot of these problems that have been created, a lot of the people who are doing the censoring and a lot of the people who are creating the stink don't belong to the intersectional identity that they are standing on behalf of. And it seems that a lot of the people who I talk to who are from these intersectional identities that are trying to be spoke for, they really want nothing to do with it. So I have kind of a hypothesis that it's in lieu of actually being good people, people come up with pet causes that, and social justice being one of those pet causes. They don't have any integrity themselves, therefore they stand up for somebody who they believe is downtrodden in order to make themselves feel better, but it has nothing to do with the actual person who is suffering, or, well, who they feel is suffering. So I think that might be.
But I mean, notice how self-censorship also enters the picture there on both sides. So people that belong to the oppressed group very often don't speak up because they feel uncomfortable doing that to kind of compromise their own cause. And on the other hand, people on the so-called oppressed group don't speak up because they feel afraid of the consequences. So there's a lot of self-censorship going on.
And have you seen the videos, like, for example, Antifa getting up into the whole Minneapolis, the raising of Minneapolis? There's videos of the Black Lives Matter protesters, even people who don't belong to it but are just part of the community, stopping these people from vandalizing. And there's these very, I don't know, heated discussions. Like you see, there was what appeared to be a Caucasian Antifa member, and he was being pulled aside by one of his African-American supposed, well, allies, quote unquote, and being told, hey, this is not how we do this, because he was, I believe, spray painting a government building or something like that.
Okay, sorry to interrupt, but
no, please do.
We should move to the end of it. We are having our annual staff's conference event on June 5th and 6th. So details of that can be found on the SAF's website, and it will be held on Zoom as well. And if you are a SAF's member in good standing, please update your membership if you're not. We will be having the, I should say that to myself as well, as I haven't updated mine. But we'll be having the AGM following the annual meeting for members of the association. So please come and attend. I don't know if anybody wanted to just talk to what we'll be talking about there. I don't have it actually up. Yeah, Francis, you can say.
Yeah. So on the 5th, Samir Gandesha is going to be giving the Furity, I believe it's the Furity lecture. It's going to be, I'll send out notification of the exact time and the link and so on. And then on Saturday, there is going to be a number of talks. This is the SAF's actual annual meeting, but that comes afterwards. And you don't have to be a member of SAF's to view the talks. Joanne Boucher from the University of Winnipeg is going to be giving a talk. Stephen Perot from Mount St. Vincent and myself will be talking about diversity policy. And then Samir Gandesha is going to be giving his kind of keynote speech for the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship. Yes, so that's the program that Robert's putting up there. So you don't have to be a member of Society for, of course, we really like it if you did become a member. It would be a good idea, but it's open. All these things are open to the public through Zoom, except for the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship actual meeting, which is, I believe, I think that's the wrong, oh, no, sorry, that's the 2019. Sorry, I was looking down below, but the 2020, and the meeting itself is at, I guess, after 4 o'clock. Is that right, Robert? Because it has the keynote addresses from 2:30 to 4, and then we have the meeting. Is that right?
Can you hear me? I'm having trouble. Wait.
Yeah, I can speak to that.
Oh, okay, yeah, sorry, I couldn't get back to the screen.
Yeah, at 4 o'clock the sessions end, and at 4:15 we'll reconvene those people who are members in good standing to vote on the motion on the floor, and also to talk about finances and all the other sorts of boring things one does when one's a member of an association, of a society. But the 3 sessions during the day are open to the public.
And just to note, as it said on the screen, the time will be starting and ending will be Eastern Standard Time. So our meeting today was advertised as Mountain Time. So please remember that it's Ontario time for the meeting times, just like we were in London, like we usually would be. What? Okay, so I guess that's it. I don't know if anybody wanted to have the final word. Otherwise, I just wanted to thank everybody for coming today. I really appreciated the turnout. We had I think we had about 23 people when we started, and for the last bit we were down to about 19, which is a pretty good turnout overall. Having an in-person event, I think it would be hard to even get out maybe this amount. Usually, so it's great to bring people together from across the country and to see everybody's interest